The morning air at RAF Kenley carried the metallic tang of high-octane fuel and the distant rumble of Merlin engines warming up for combat patrol. March 1941. Britain had survived the worst of the Blitz. But the air war over the Channel continued with brutal efficiency. Every day, young pilots climbed into their Hurricanes and Spitfires, knowing they faced an enemy with a technical advantage, so decisive it might as well have been written into their death warrants. Beatrice Shilling stood beside the dispersal hut, watching mechanics swarm around a hurricane like worker bees tending their queen. She had traveled 60 miles from Farnborough on her Norton motorcycle, leather satchels strapped across her back, carrying 6 brass washers that weighed less than an ounce each. In her pocket was a small butane torch. She had no authorization for what she was about to do. No approval from the Air Ministry. No signed paperwork from her superiors at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. If this went wrong, if the pilot died because of her modification, she would face court-martial at best, prison at worst. But 32 years old and 6 years into her career as one of Britain's few female aeronautical engineers, Beatrice Shilling had learned that sometimes waiting for permission meant watching good men die. The problem had been killing RAF pilots since July 1940. It was devastatingly simple, mathematically predictable, and tactically catastrophic. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that magnificent piece of engineering that powered both the Hurricane and Spitfire, used an SU carburetor with a float chamber to regulate fuel flow. When a pilot spotted an enemy aircraft below and pushed his stick forward, diving toward the attack, negative G-forces threw the fuel to the top of the float chamber instead of feeding it to the engine. The carburetor flooded. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. 1.5 seconds. That was how long it took for a Messerschmitt Bf-109 to close 300 yards and line up a killing shot. That was how long RAF pilots had to watch their instruments while their engines starved for fuel and their aircraft became a gliding coffin. The Germans had no such problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines used fuel injection, a system unaffected by gravitational forces or violent maneuvers. German pilots could dive, climb, roll, or fly inverted without losing a single heartbeat of engine power. They had learned to exploit the British weakness with surgical precision. When a Spitfire dove to attack, they simply waited for the inevitable engine stall, then circled back for the kill. 14 Hurricanes had gone down that week alone. 9 Spitfires. The combat reports all told the same story. British pilot spots German fighter. British pilot initiates diving attack. Engine fails. German pilot either escapes or, more often, returns to finish what the carburetor had started. Shilling had interviewed the survivors. She had read maintenance logs until her eyes burned. She had spent 11 months working on the problem, while Rolls-Royce engineers designed a proper pressure carburetor that would eliminate the float chamber entirely. But that solution would not be ready until 1943. Perhaps 1944. The young men climbing into cockpits each morning did not have 2 years to wait. Her solution had come to her in January while working on a bench engine in the RAE laboratory. Simple physics. The carburetor flooded because fuel could flow unrestricted when gravity reversed. What if you restricted the flow? Not completely. Just precisely enough to prevent flooding while still delivering adequate fuel at full power. A brass disc with a carefully calculated aperture. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Limit maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at wide-open throttle. She had machined 17 different prototypes before finding the correct dimensions. 0.125 inches in diameter. The hole in the center was 0.04 inches. Those measurements represented hundreds of hours of calculation, testing, and refinement. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve at combat power. The margin for error was measured in thousandths of an inch. Bench tests proved it worked. The restrictor prevented flooding during simulated negative G conditions without significantly reducing engine performance. But simulated conditions were not combat. Combat was 300 miles per hour. Combat was forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness straps. Combat was death measured in seconds. Sergeant William Cooper, the ground crew chief, met her beside the Hurricane. He had lost 19 pilots to engine failures in the past year. When Shilling showed him the brass washer and explained what it did, he did not ask about authorization or approval. He simply opened his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad, engine already warming, pilot already strapped in for the morning patrol. 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 years maintaining Merlin engines under combat conditions. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and carburetor. The restrictor slid into place. 60 seconds with the butane torch created a clean, solid weld. The modification was invisible unless you knew where to look. Squadron leader Jonathan Davies, 24 years old, with 41 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills, ran through his pre-flight checks. Oil pressure steady. Coolant temperature within normal range. Magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes and taxied toward the runway, completely unaware that his Hurricane now carried an unauthorized modification that violated approximately 40 different Air Ministry regulations. Shilling raised her binoculars and watched the Hurricane climb through 800 feet. 2,000. The aircraft banked south toward Dungeness and the channel beyond. German fighters had been active over Dungeness all week. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he would have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it would not. She waited on the tarmac. Cooper stood beside her. Neither spoke. Around them, ground crews prepared aircraft for afternoon patrols. Fuel trucks rumbled between dispersal points. Mechanics shouted technical jargon across the hardstand. Normal sounds of a fighter station at war. Shilling heard none of it. She was calculating fuel flow rates, float chamber dynamics, negative G duration. The mathematics worked, but mathematics were not bullets. No death. Not a young pilot spinning toward the Earth with a dead engine. 40 minutes passed. An hour. Radio silence from Davies's section, which could mean anything. No contact with enemy aircraft. Or contact, so intense there was no time to report. Or Davies was dead, and his Hurricane was wreckage scattered across a French field. At 9:37, the radio crackled. 3 Hurricanes inbound. 2 minutes out, Shilling raised the binoculars. 3 dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft returning. No loses. The Hurricanes entered the circuit. Davies landed first. Taxied to dispersal. Cut the engine. When he climbed from the cockpit and pulled off his helmet, he was smiling. That was unusual. Pilots rarely smiled after combat patrols. They usually looked exhausted, haunted by what they had seen and done. Davy looked excited. Cooper asked the critical question. Any problems with the engine? Sire? Davies looked at Cooper, then at Shilling, then back at Cooper. Best the Merlin has ever run. He said he had spotted 2 Messerschmitt 109 seconds at 14,000 feet. Both aircraft flying east toward France. Davies had positioned his section above them for altitude advantage, then pushed into a steep dive, 400 miles per hour. Negative G forces strong enough to lift him against his harness straps. The dive that should have killed his engine, but the Merlin had kept running, full power through the entire dive. Davies had closed to 200 yards before the German pilot saw him. He had fired a 3-second burst and saw strikes on the Messerschmitt's left wing root. The German fighter broke hard right and fled toward France. Davies had pulled up, climbed back to altitude. The engine had performed flawlessly. It was the first time in 11 months that Davies had successfully pressed a diving attack without his engine cutting out. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Shilling told him. She explained the restrictor, the brass washer, the fuel flow limitation, the complete lack of authorization. Davies stared at her for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Cooper. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station," he said. "Today." Shilling tried to explain it was not authorized. Davies did not care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kenley had lost friends to engine failures. If the Air Ministry wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed working engines. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that afternoon. 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with restrictors over the next 3 days. 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks successfully pressed against German fighters. Pilots reported the Merlin engines ran perfectly. Word spread through fighter command with the speed of gossip in a boarding school. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the restrictor. They wanted it. All of them. Immediately, Shilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days. Could she come to their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be manufactured? The problem was supply. Shilling had machined 6 restrictors herself in the RAE workshop. Manufacturing thousands would require proper production facilities, brass stock, precision machining equipment, quality control systems. She needed approval from the Air Ministry. She needed funding. She needed time. She got approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal. They called it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the production contract. They could manufacture 500 restrictors per week. Installation would begin immediately at every fighter station in Britain. By March 25th, installation teams were ready. 600 restrictors manufactured. 40 stations on the schedule. 3,000 Merlin engines waiting for modification. Shilling loaded her Norton with tools and restrictors and headed north toward Biggin Hill. The ground crews worked in shifts. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line. Weld the restrictor in place. Reconnect the line. Test for leaks. The welding had to be perfect. A faulty weld at altitude could starve the engine completely and kill the pilot just as surely as a German bullet. Shilling supervised every installation personally. She checked every weld, tested every connection, rejected 3 restrictors that did not meet specifications. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Shilling moved to Hornchurch, then Northolt, then Tangmere. The pattern repeated at every station. Ground crews worked 12-hour shifts. Pilots flew combat patrols with modified engines. 0 failures reported. The restrictor worked exactly as designed. Pilots started calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice. The nickname came from Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer At Rolls-Royce Supercharger Division, it was crude, British military humor, slightly inappropriate, vaguely suggestive. Shilling did not mind. She had spent 6 years working with RAF personnel. She understood how military men dealt with stress and mortality. If crude nicknames helped them remember the modification that might save their lives, she would accept any name they wanted to use. The nickname spread faster than the restrictor itself. By April, every pilot in Fighter Command knew about Miss Shilling's orifice. Some pilots refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had the modification installed. Squadron commanders supported them. They had watched too many talented young men die from a problem that could be fixed with a brass washer costing less than a shilling. German intelligence noticed the change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April mentioned improved RAF diving attacks. British fighters no longer broke off pursuit during negative G maneuvers. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage had evaporated like morning mist over the channel. By mid-April, Shilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines. Every Hurricane and Spitfire in Fighter Command, every operational training unit, every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off production lines at Castle, Bromwich, and Southampton came with restrictors pre-installed. The results were measurable. Fighter Command tracked combat statistics with obsessive precision. Every engagement, every kill, every loss. The numbers told a story that needed no embellishment. March 19, 41. Before the restrictor, RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks against German aircraft. Pilots broke off pursuit. Enemy fighters escaped. Or German pilots recognized the weakness and deliberately lured British fighters into diving attacks. Knowing the Merlin engines would fail. April 1941. After the restrictor, engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0.4%. Almost non-existent. The few failures that did occur were unrelated to the carburetor, mechanical problems, battle damage, normal combat attrition. The kill-to-loss ratio improved immediately. March had been brutal. Fighter Command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires in combat. Shot down 61 German aircraft. A ratio of 1.3 to 1, barely breaking even. April was different. 29 British fighters lost. 94 German aircraft destroyed. A ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor was not the only factor, but squadron commanders credited it as a major contributor. Pilots reported increased confidence in combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, flying Spitfires out of Duxford, had experienced engine failure 4 times before the restrictor. After installation, he pressed diving attacks without hesitation. He destroyed 3 Messerschmitt 109 seconds in May, 2 more in June. He credited the restrictor with giving him the confidence to commit to aggressive tactics that would have been suicidal in March. Beatrice Shilling moved on to other projects. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her busy with dozens of technical challenges. Cold weather starting systems for engines in Iceland and Russia. High-altitude fuel mixture problems. Improved supercharger systems for late-war Merlin variants. She worked on the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile, developing fuel delivery systems for rocket engines. She researched wet runway braking effects for jet aircraft, publishing 3 technical papers that became required reading at aviation schools. She even helped design a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team, applying aerodynamics and friction management principles to winter sports. But the restrictor remained her most famous contribution. Pilots remembered it. Engineers studied it. After the war, aviation schools taught it as an example of elegant problem-solving under pressure. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable life-saving results. Everything good engineering should achieve. King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1948. The ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace. Shilling wore her formal dress, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, then went back to work at Farnborough the next morning. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that women belonged in technical fields. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment continued for another 21 years until her retirement in 1969. 33 years of continuous service. She never reached the top administrative positions. Those roles were reserved for men. The RAF leadership structure did not promote women to director-level posts regardless of accomplishment. Shilling accepted this limitation. She preferred hands-on engineering work anyway. Laboratory testing, field modifications, real problems with real solutions. The work itself was the reward. She married George Naylor in September 1938. He worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment as an aerodynamicist. According to legend, which may or may not be true, but which everyone who knew them believed, she refused to marry him until he had also earned the Brooklands Gold Star for lapping the circuit at over 100 miles per hour on a motorcycle. He achieved it in 1938. When war started, George volunteered for RAF Bomber Command. He flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron, completing 31 combat missions over Germany. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for voluntarily flying an extra tour beyond his required missions. He survived when half of all bomber crew members did not. He returned to Farnborough in 1944 with tinnitus and other health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. They never talked about his missions. He never asked about her projects. They kept work and marriage in separate compartments, a practical arrangement that worked for them. Shilling continued racing motorcycles when time permitted. She had stopped racing at Brooklands when war started. The famous circuit had been converted to aircraft production facilities, but she still rode her Norton. Fast riding helped her think, helped her solve problems that laboratory work could not crack. Some of her best engineering ideas came while riding at 90 miles per hour on country roads. The engine vibration and wind noise clearing her mind of everything except the pure physics of motion and power. She died on November 18, 1992, age 81, survived by her husband George and a lifetime of engineering achievements that changed aviation history. The obituaries in British newspapers focused on the restrictor, the brass washer, Miss Shilling's orifice. Everything else she accomplished was reduced to footnotes. Her legacy lived on in unexpected ways. In 2011, a Weatherspoon pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Shilling. The Brooklands Museum purchased her racing trophies and badges in 2015. Winchester Heritage celebrated her in 2018 as one of Hampshire's extraordinary women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Shilling Building for electronic engineering students. The restrictor itself became a teaching example in engineering schools worldwide. Simple solution to complex problem. Immediate implementation under wartime pressure. Measurable. Life-saving results. Some universities kept original restrictors on display. Small brass washers in museum cases. Physical reminders that elegant solutions do not require complexity. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, said it years later with the clarity that only time and perspective can bring. Beatrice Shilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. She had stood on a tarmac at RAF Kenley one March morning in 1941 with 6 brass washers in her leather satchel and 0 authorization to install them. She had watched a pilot climb into his Hurricane for what might be his last mission. She had made a decision that could have ended her career or saved his life. The pilot had returned. The engine had worked. The modification had spread through fighter command like wildfire through dry grass. 2,100 Merlin engines, thousands of combat missions, countless lives saved by a brass washer that cost less than a shilling to manufacture. That was the story they told about Beatrice Shilling, the woman who fixed the Spitfire, the engineer who saved the RAF, the motorcycle racer who became one of Britain's most important wartime innovators. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler than that. She had seen a problem. She had found a solution. She had refused to wait for permission while good men died. She had done what engineers are supposed to do. She had made things work.